Good morning, everyone, or maybe good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name's Val, and I'm very happy to join you today. I'm joined by my colleague, Nick Beretta, who will be helping me out with the questions later on. So just a couple of things as a few participants join in. We will take questions a little bit later on during the webinar, so please don't hesitate to type in any questions that you may have, and we'll do our very best to answer all of those. So today we're talking about orchestra, mixing an orchestra, both live and due to current circumstances to streaming applications. And I had an absolute pleasure speaking with Ian Barfoot, a very experienced engineer who does many different sort of things, but notably a lot of orchestra stuff as well. So we'll be sharing that interview with you in a couple of minutes. During the interview, we'll talk about a couple of things. So the challenges of mixing to orchestra, but also ideas of approaches to overcome those challenges. So lots of interesting stuff coming up in just a second. One thing I did want to mention, some of you may have clocked already on our social media. Today we've just launched an SQ MADI card. So if any of you guys are using the SQ platform, we do know that a lot of people were requesting a MADI card for SQ. That's just been launched today. So SQ MADI card for 64 by 64 channels of MADI, now available for SQ. So go check that out when you have a moment. So as I mentioned, we're going to share with you an interview with Ian Barfoot, and it was a great pleasure to talk to him. Lots of insight and lots of experience to share with him. And again, if you have any questions, please type them in and we'll do our very best to get back to you just after the interview. So without further ado, I'll play that for you and catch up with you just after. So Ian, hi, thanks very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. Your reputation precedes you, highly experienced engineer, but for those that don't know you, maybe you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, and what you're up to.
Yeah, my name's Ian Barfoot. I'm very old now. I've been around a rather a long time, but I started, gosh, 35, 38 years ago, doing location classical recording for a small independent company. So doing brass bands, choirs, orchestras, that sort of thing. And then gravitated to doing large scale live events, mostly with orchestras, though I dipped a toe into the prog rock world with an artist, which also involved orchestras, choirs, rock bands, inflatable animals, you name it. We threw it at it. And I guess I've got a bit of a reputation for doing orchestras for people. So I do a bit of jazz and a bit of big band stuff. And now, again, back to my roots, doing a bit more recording, which is lovely.
Sure. Yeah, I think that the times are with recording and well, anything that involves not having people there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, this whole live streaming thing is completely new to me. I'm shocked by it, and our socially distanced performances are they're very strange. And talking to some other guys in the same industry, they're finding it very weird because they're recording film scores and stuff in rooms that they know, and they're finding the orchestras are sounding very, very different because everybody's 2 meters apart.
Of course, yeah.
Very strange indeed.
Yeah, well, I suppose it means you need slightly larger rooms. Um,
Yeah, I mean, we've been working in Symphony Hall this last couple of weeks, and it's strange to see 38, 45 people absolutely filling such a massive platform.
yeah.
And the challenges that brings. We
So
get there.
yeah, so obviously today we're talking about more orchestra-based things. But when you're mixing orchestra, As you mentioned, you've had a bit of experience mixing more prog rock, more maybe a traditional live pop music approach.
Sure.
What would you say are specific challenges that come up when you're mixing orchestras, on the maybe audiophile side, but also in terms of workflow when you're mixing? What's the biggest sort of challenges you have to overcome?
I think it's generally it's a speed thing. They are quite often one-day affairs and not a tour with masses of production rehearsal. You've also got the thing where if you do get a rehearsal, it's likely to be the late morning, early afternoon before the performance in the evening. So if you like, you've got to run at things, but you've also got no spare time. You can't go through the minutiae of massive amounts of EQ and what have you, because you just even though there's this amazing thing called copy and paste, you still haven't got enough time for it. So it's almost you have to have everything in place so you can work very quickly, and a good team around you, because you can't lay out 120 microphones or something on your own. It's just far too, the numbers are just far too great.
Sure.
So I tend to do very little, or I do as little as possible anyway, because I think that's the best way.
Yeah, keep it simple. Keep
Yeah,
it simple, absolutely.
absolutely.
And then so essentially the biggest challenge is time, which means that having something that's easy to navigate is crucial.
Yeah,
And then, if I understand correctly, something that kind of sounds good out of the box straight away. Um,
yeah. I mean, the one thing is just forget everything else other than a really, really good mic amp. I don't care whose it is, but it to me it starts with a good player with a good instrument, and it's not unusual for me to have a player with, say, a multi-million pound Stradivari, um, which, funnily enough, we don't go anywhere near with a microphone. If we
yeah,
have to have a microphone, we leave it to them. Um, and then after that, you just need clean everything. You know, uh, it's highly unusual for me to use any EQ at all, other than top and bottom filters.
okay,
And I can preset most of those even before I get there. So I have kind of like a standard show file that, all the first violins get a 100 hertz high pass filter thrown in. Then you can fine tune it. If it's really, really windy, that's just not going to be good enough. And you can afford a slightly higher frequency. And also don't be frightened of using the top cut as well, because there's very few things really that need 20k in them out in a field, because you're just not going to hear it, and it's probably going
sure.
to save your life a bit to get rid of some of it.
Yeah, I think when doing orchestras, especially outdoors, which is the next level of challenge, is more uh, the environment rather than
Mm.
the actual source itself. So you're playing more with the wind or the temperature changes or
Yep.
maybe even the rain. Um,
Yes. Oh yes.
yeah, so you're mixing more around the environment than you are focusing on
Yeah.
the sources themselves.
And I think also with doing the outdoor kind of events like that, you are more involved in creating the sound of the audience, of the orchestra, rather than capturing the sound of the orchestra, because you've got to have a reasonable appreciation of what an orchestra should sound like, and try and emulate that, if you like, in the middle of a muddy field,
Of course.
in July in England.
Yeah,
Um,
sure. Because I mean, typically, or let's say historically, orchestras, uh, the sound of an orchestra comes with the room that orchestra is in.
Absolutely, and
And
also the orchestration. So, I mean, we've just been doing some Bartok, which I have to say I'm not fond of, and we've also been doing some Vaughan Williams, and the Vaughan Williams was like so lyrical. It's smooth and lush and huge, and you could almost bathe in it. It's that kind of thing. Whereas the Bartok was challenging, interesting. I found it a bit strident, but it's the, it was when it was written as opposed to the Vaughan
Hmm.
Williams a little bit later. And you have to sort of bring all that out as well,
Yeah, which
or allow it to come forward. You don't, that's, you're not creating so much a performance, really, I
yeah,
don't think.
it's very much to do with being respectful
Yeah,
of what it is.
totally. No, I absolutely agree.
Okay.
Absolutely agree.
And so in terms of facilitating that approach of really respecting what the orchestra should sound like and being able um, to work fast enough in the conditions that you're working in, what's the first thing that you look for when you're deciding on a mixing console in terms of what platform you're going to go for?
Lots and lots of inputs and lots of resources. The last thing I need is to run out of anything.
Okay.
So I kind of start at the 100 plus inputs. If a console won't do that, then it's not on my list at all.
Okay.
Um, I tend to work probably in a very individual style. I think most guys do, but I don't like traditional layouts. I'll sort of lay out things depending on the job. So to be able to uh, kind of almost beyond custom layers, if you like, I
Okay.
like anything anywhere, which obviously that's a thing that you guys do quite well.
Hmm.
I don't like the restraints of, though I came from it, of having all the inputs on my left and definitely outputs on the right. Um, and then I get everything laid out basically so that I can find everything coming in. And then I just create a working layer, which is where everything I need at the time is per per item.
Okay.
And that seems to work for me. And I think also with the nice thing about orchestras is there are very few moment to moment changes. You know exactly where the solos be. You know exactly how long they'll be for.
Hmm.
There's very little big obligato pieces where they just go on and on and on. Whereas in prog, they can go on for long enough to go and fetch a cup of tea, drink it, and look for a bacon sandwich. But the orchestral stuff is not like that at all. You do need to obviously have, if you know it's going to be solo violin, but not with a soloist, it'll be the leader. So you
Hmm.
always know it's going to be channel number one on the desk.
Yeah.
So you can bring that up into your working layer and quickly have access to. Sorry, that's making no sense because I'm actually moving a fader up and down on my desk with a finger. That's just nervous habit where number one will be. Yeah, you just sort of know it's going to be there. You know how long it's going to be there. So if you need to, you can just feature it for a few seconds.
Hmm.
But in fairness, the the orchestration will actually reduce everybody else in the orchestra and just allow the leader to play out. So you virtually have to do nothing. That's good. I'm quite a lazy person, I think. Really. I
Well,
like
less
all
is
that.
more. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Yeah. Cool.
Absolutely, 100%.
And so you're using dLive at the moment because
I
it kind of
am.
ticks
I
your
am.
boxes, as you mentioned, your technical requirements. You've been using dLive for quite a while now, I think.
Yes. I was thinking the other day how long I've actually been playing with one, and I've got a feeling I think it was very, very soon after they were released. The first thing I took it out on was um, and this absolutely slayed me, was I was asked to do live performance of some gaming music. I think it was Pokemon. So I did Pokemon, Tomb Raider, but I was surprised, and it had been orchestrated for good orchestra and worked with the conductor and stuff, and that was amazing. Had the dLive on that for the first time and just went, wow, the flexibility was, because I came from iLive, so
Okay.
I knew that I could move stuff about, but it was just like another level of speed, which I liked, and the sound was immediately better than something that I thought already was good.
Okay. So yeah, it was a pleasant step up and an easy evolution.
Almost, I'd say a leap, a big leap forward.
So you were familiar with the iLive workflow.
Mm.
Transitioning over to the new platform, I imagine, was fairly straightforward in that case.
It was very, very easy.
And then, so talking a bit more technically in terms of deployment and stuff, how do you usually spec your I/O when you're using dLive?
Most people, their setups are already cast in stone. So they
Hmm.
have kind of like a line input system or an input line system. And so you just bung a load of inputs into, or input racks into a box and sit
Hmm.
them next to everybody else's box and patch a bunch of wires across. A lot of people are still very reticent to use digital splits.
And yeah, orchestra is quite specific. All of the orchestra stuff I remember having done for a while was all that. It was all analog on stage, off the stage, and once it's off the stage, then you decide what you do with it.
Yeah,
Um, Split
yeah,
it
yeah.
to however many places you need to go. Um,
The one thing I do use quite a lot, I must admit, is I've got a MADI card, the
okay,
Super MADI card, and a lot of the recording facilities I interface with, they've got legacy MADI capability. Obviously, I keep Dante cards, but the one that gets the most use is the Super MADI card, because then the recording truck can just chuck 4 or 6 or 8 lines of fiber out,
sure.
and they pick up everything off my head amp. Um, do them as tie lines, and it's so easy. Push a button, draw a slash across the screen,
Yeah,
and they've got it all. And it's worked very well. I have to admit, it's pretty seamless.
cool. And so we've got our sources off the stage. We're at
Hmm.
our input rack. I understand you've just been on a fairly large format event, and you've made quite large use of our Prime cards.
Yeah,
Um,
that's wow. That is a game changer. That
yeah,
is a
so
game
tell
changer.
us a little bit about what you've done with Prime just now.
Um, we start. I got involved in. Again, I don't really understand the terms, but I think it's a kind of like an as live streaming event and archive recording with an orchestra in Birmingham. And when it was suggested to me, I suggested to the uh, my client, the production company, that we should certainly go with Prime cards on the main inputs. And actually, what we've ended up doing is going with Prime cards on pretty much all the inputs.
Okay.
So we come off very, very good microphones, and we're using mostly um, DPA and Sony high resolution stuff.
Hmm.
This is all crazy specification microphones, um, you know, insane amount of money, and in uh, very traditional formats. So we're using an expanded Decca tree from the 1950s,
Hmm.
um, and a bit of Bloomlin and a bit of Spaced Omni, that sort of stuff. And we go straight into the prime input cards. And then 100 meters away, almost in a remote location, is myself and the Surface and a pair of monitors.
Hmm.
And you start to listen to these things, and it's like, oh, that air conditioning is a bit loud, even to the point where just around by Symphony Hall in Birmingham, it must be a church or a building somewhere that's got a carillon, which is it's a before the clock strikes the hour, it plays a carillon,
Okay.
and which is beautiful, but not when you've just gone into record and you've got 40 odd musicians sitting there waiting for the downbeat sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you think, sorry guys, hang on for the bells, please. Um, but as you up the resolution and the quality of your input, everything else in the chain's got to go with it. The console's running at 96K. We're now using the 32 bit input cards. There is nothing wrong with the ordinary ones, and the two or three we're having to use, which I won't tell you what we're using them for, but yeah, There's a natural reverb chamber, so we've got a couple of mics in that,
Hmm.
which is like a big concrete tunnel that runs around the back of the room. That's on ordinary DX inputs, and the talk back and shout mics are on ordinary inputs.
Of course,
But apart from that, absolutely everything else is on primes, and loving them to bits. Loving
very
them to
good,
bits.
very good.
Very, very quiet, but also very open. They don't. The nice thing is they're not coloured. The last thing that classical orchestrally type recording
Hmm.
people want is anything to do with colour. The last thing I need is any dirty warmth added to the first violin section.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um,
That transparency is absolutely crucial, I think,
yeah,
in orchestra stuff. And there are applications within orchestra where having a bit of warmth can be beneficial
yep.
if you're doing anything a bit more contemporary, things where there's some electronics brought into an orchestra. And of course, the tube pre-emulation is a great tool to have if you want that. But if you
Well,
don't,
that
you
is
don't
my.
have to.
If I'm doing, I do this kind of dance thing generally. When we have real summers where we go out and do gigs in the field, if you remember those, I've spent a couple of years with a kind of an orchestral crossover thing, doing Ibiza dance tunes,
Okay.
but with a 40 odd piece orchestra on stage and a DJ and singers and tracks, and absolutely every time it's the two for me it's the two stage valve
Yep.
emulation and the old optronic compressor on the back end of it, which I love to bits, I must admit.
Okay, and so you've kind of forwarded my next question. If you have a favorite compressor, it's going to be that one, is it?
Yeah, I'm afraid it is. Again, for transparency, the standard dLive compressor, the default one, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, and there really isn't. The way I use it, I can't hear it, and that's what I want. But for a good punchy vocal, I must admit I do like the Optronic. It's become a bit of a thing. I have to turn some off because otherwise, I find they're creeping everywhere. And stop it, will you?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah,
Must
no,
stop using those.
sure. And then something that's probably quite crucial for you is
I'm gonna hate this question. I know what's coming.
uh,
You're gonna say the reverb word, aren't
I
you?
am, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Just
Okay.
because, not so much because of orchestral stuff in terms of indoors, but as we were saying earlier on, being able to recreate those spaces outside is
Yeah.
vital. Do you have a go-to, or is it something that?
Oh, yeah, I'm afraid I do. And everybody that knows me is going to know this one off the top. It's actually in the console under my name. Many years ago, with the aid of Rob Clark, he said to me one day, he said, what do you really like as a reverb? And I just said this, and it was a particular one, which is based on the Cathedral Church of St. John the Divine in New York,
Okay,
which has got an absolutely glorious, glorious reverb. It's naturally about 5.8 seconds or 5.6
okay,
seconds. And he said, seriously? I said, yeah. It's glorious. And I think I've pretty much used that all the time. There's a 481, I think it
yeah,
is another one that I quite like. But I always think the St. John the Divine one, the based one, sounds more natural.
no,
Um,
that's great, and it's great that you have something that you can always go to, um, and if it comes out right, you'll know you're in the good place.
yeah, I mean, I tend to do all of the rehearsal with the off, and then you just sort of whack it on at the end and go, and it just sort of blooms outwards. And you think, yeah, that'll be fine. That'll be fine. I mean, everybody laughs about it, and I affectionately call it fairy dust because that's pretty much what it is. But you've got to get it right first. You can't.
Of course.
The way I work, can't make balanced decisions with the reverb on so much because it will cover up so many of the little artifacts, which is what it's there for. You know, that's what it does.
And then a last question for you. Talking about dLive specifically, do you have a favorite feature of dLive? Something that it really does that helps you out in terms of workflow in you know in the way you work?
It's something that I would never ever thought I would use, and I've found it to be the craziest thing that makes my life so much easy, and it's DCA Spill. Obviously, if you've got a section of, you know, uh, I can easily have 16 or 18 violin mics, first violin mics, and I'll have nearly that number of seconds. So that's an awful lot of violins to put on any sort of surface at one go. To have the DCA there, which means I've got control over the whole section. But if I hear something that is wrong, I can hit the DCA spill. Again, I'm doing this on my imaginary console in front of me on the desk. And I get that whole section comes banging up in front of me. I can make the adjustment and it's gone in an instant. And I said to myself, when it was first introduced, don't know why anybody bothers with it. It really, you know, I don't see it. I was so wrong. And I'm the first one to put my hand up in the air and go, I was so wrong. So much that on the occasions I have to use another well-known manufacturer's console, and I go to their office to do a show file because generally I haven't got a lot of time, I miss them dreadfully.
Great, fantastic. Well, I think that's been really insightful.
Okay.
You've shared a lot of experience, which is very helpful. And
I mean, I've learned a few tricks, I suppose, over the years, but nothing very clever. I always admire these guys that are, you know, they use effects like it's going out of fashion. They're almost like another member of the band, or they are another member of the band. And I don't think I ever do that. I'm just there to make things louder, really.
Sure. Well, in any case, I just want to say thank you very much for your time.
You're most welcome.
Really appreciate your
most welcome. Any questions, point them at me or whatever, and I'll do my very best to answer those questions.
We certainly will. Well, thank you very much.
All right, mate.
Cheers.
Cool.
So, welcome back. I hope that was insightful. I really enjoyed having that conversation with Ian. So, yeah, thanks again, Ian, for spending some time with us. So again, please don't hesitate to pop any questions that you might have, and we'll come to those in a couple of seconds. But before we do, I wanted to touch on a couple of things that he talks about during the interview. So the first of those is the prime cards. So he's been making use of those quite substantially. He's got a lot of praise for those, which we're very happy about. So I just wanted to share a little bit of info about Prime itself, just so that everyone's kind of on the same page. Let me just get it up for you. There we go. You should have that on your screens, hopefully. So Prime, what is Prime? So before we talk about Prime specifically, I want to make sure everyone understands sort of where Prime lives, or how you can use Prime with dLive, but also some of our other mixing platforms as well. So Prime Prime preamps come in a card of 8 preamps, and they live inside our expander, the DX32. Now, DX32 is part of our Everything IO family of expander boxes. So there's a wide range, and we're not going to talk about those today because I'm sure many of you know them and you can check them out on our website. But Prime lives inside the DX32 expander. And DX32 is a 96 kilohertz modular expander, which means you've got 4 card slots in it, and you can configure that to match your application. So if you want to have 4 cards of 8 inputs for 32 inputs, you can do that. If you want to have 2 input cards, some analog outputs, some digital outputs over AES, you can do that as well. So basically you can configure that rack to do whatever you like in terms of ins and outs. It does have 2 power supplies, so it's got a redundant backup power supply, and it can be connected redundantly to mix racks using the 2 DX ports on the front panel. So those are 2 redundant ports, a primary with a secondary. So it can be rack mounted, or it's got little feet. If you want to put it on a desktop somewhere or on a shelf, you can do that as well. So where does DX32 go? So first of all, we're talking about dLive today. DX32 works with dLive by connecting it to the DX ports, either on an S-Class mix rack or on a C-Class. So both of these, both S-Class and C-Class, have 2 ports, so you can connect 2 DX32s to each of these racks. The only difference is the S-Class has a secondary redundant connection where the C-Class does not. So it's not 4 ports on the S-Class, it's 2 with a secondary backup port. You can also use DX32, and this is where you really sort of start to expand your capabilities with DX32, but also with Prime on SQ and on Avantis. So using the S-Link port on the rear of the console, or if you're using an S-Link card in SQ, you can connect a DX32 to SQ and to Avantis as well. Finally, there's another place you can use a DX32, and that's if you're using a GX4816 with an SQ or an Avantis, or even maybe a dLive, by using one of the 2 DX ports, or even both of the 2 DX ports as well. So DX32 will connect to the GX4816 as well, if you wanted to have more outputs, and more specifically, if you want to add Prime. So again, you can have 32 Prime inputs if you want, you can have 24 ins and 8 Prime outputs if you want, or you might want to have some AES digital outputs. Really flexible, really, so you can build it up on your application. So let's have a little quick look at the Prime cards specifically. So 2 cards, as I mentioned previously, an 8 preamp input and an 8 analog line level output cards. These are basically, we wrote a blank check to R&D, so to speak, and said, look, we just want you to make the best preamp available on the market. So we've used all new 32-bit converters, which offer an incredibly high signal to noise ratio, extremely low harmonic distortion. We're using hi-fi grade Nichicon capacitors. Again, everything's been designed in these to improve your harmonic distortion, your signal to noise ratio, the headroom, the frequency and phase response. It's just really the best input preamp you can find on the market, and then the best converters for analog outputs that you could possibly find. So, you know, just having a quick look at the Prime card itself, you can see it's properly built up. There's a few other bits of technology in there, like DC coupled gain stages, again, which improve the low frequency response. Those need to be hand trimmed, so every Prime card has an excruciating quality control in manufacturing, because with those DC coupled gain stages, excuse me, those need to be hand trimmed. So it really is a labor of love to get an extremely high level of precision. So that's Prime, and again, definitely something worth trying out. And what's really nice is they do work with dLive, but you can use them on SQ, you can use them on Avantis. So really a flexible platform, and something that's definitely worth trying out. So, and then the other thing that Ian talks about is his use of DCA Spills. Now, we talked about DCA Spills a couple of weeks ago during one of the webinars, but I did want to touch on it again because it is something really nice to have and to deploy. And I'll show you, as soon as I can find that, there we go, an idea of how to use DCA Spills and how that can be deployed. So I've got a dLive set up here on Director. So you can see I've got a bunch of inputs now. I don't have 128, but I've simulated a bunch of violins, cellos, and if I need to get to my vocals, this is my left bank of faders on an S3000. I need to S5000, sorry. I need to scroll down and get to wherever those inputs are. So the idea of using DCA Spills is that I can set up DCAs, which are a master fader of my input channels. And just by clicking the mix button or pressing the mix button on my DCA, it will snap onto my fader layer here directly to those channels that are concerned by this DCA. So if I bring that DCA block up here, there we go, and I just show you the routing, you can see I've got all of my strings in one DCA, all of my wind in one DCA, all of my brass in a DCA, all my vocals and all of my effects in separate DCAs. So now if I'm on my surface and I hit the mix button, you'll see the left bank now has just snapped to my strings. Oh, I need to do something on the vocals really quickly. I hit the mix on the vocals and it brings it up. So I don't need to flick through my layers to get to those channels really quickly. I can go and grab my effects returns, my brass. And when you've got massive channel counts, you know, anything up to 128 plus your 16 stereo effects returns, using these DCAs can be really, really useful to work much faster. This becomes even more the case when you're working on a platform such as a C1500, which is our most compact surface. C1500 is only 12 faders like this, and so we'll emulate that really quickly. If I go to my surface strip assign, and my first bank of 12 faders, we'll imagine this is a C1500, and we'll go down to the last layer and we'll drop the DCAs there. So let me just grab those. Let's do 12, okay. So now my last layer of my C1500, I don't have all these faders on a C1500. My last layer is all I've got. I've just got 12 faders in front of me and 6 layers. So without even having to go down into those layers, I can immediately snap in and out of my channels. So I select my strings DCA, I've got my strings, I've got my flute, my winds, I've got my brass, I've got my vocals, my effects, etc. So without even going into any of my 6 layers, I can access all of my input channels really quickly, which makes a really compact surface really flexible and really easy to use. Then something else that Ian talks about, and I just wanted to show you those because he's quite fond of those, is the reverb. So he mentioned that he uses a reverb that's in his name. So if you open the spatial reverberator and you go into the library, you'll find one which is called, I went past it, Ian Barfoot. So that's his signature reverb, and you're welcome to explore that. Again, it starts with a 3-second decay, but you can push that up, and something that he uses really to replicate an acoustic space, if you will. But there are lots of different ones. So he talks about using the 481. There's other signature ones like the Glocus Gold, which he uses quite extensively. So lots of things there as well. Finally, one thing I wanted to show you really quickly, and it's one of my favorite features on dLive, is the copy paste function. So again, when you're working in orchestra environments, typically you'll want to apply an EQ to one instrument and have the same thing. So you've got a section of violins and you want to have the same EQ on all of them. So here we've got an example on my bank view. I've got 4 violins. Okay, so I'm going to open my first one and I'm going to apply an EQ. It might be this, it might be that, and I've got a bit of high pass filter going on as well. And so I want the same thing on all of my violins, maybe my violas as well. So we've got a really nice function, which is the copy paste function. And you'll find copy paste as a physical button on the dLive surface as well. So by pressing and holding the copy, I can copy my EQ and press paste and just paste it to all of my strings or all of my violins. And that's it, it's done. If I want to copy the whole channel, I can do that too by pressing copy, clicking select, and then paste, and select, and I've pasted that to all of those channels as well. So you can copy just one parameter, such as the EQ or the high pass or just the compressor, but you can also copy the whole channel by pressing copy, select on the channel, paste, and select on all the channels you want to paste to. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about regarding our conversation, and I'll happily take any of your questions that you might have. I've seen there's been a few questions already come in. I might get Nick to join me.
Hi, Val.
Hi, Nick.
Here we go.
So,
fantastic interview with Ian, by the way. It's always nice to hear from him and his techniques. Yeah, there were a couple of questions, so maybe I can take one because there's an interesting one. Timo was asking, how does dLive sound when you have 100 input channels altogether? And we know from experience with a lot of early digital mixers that there could be an issue on some platforms, on some architectures, where you start using more and more channels, and then all of a sudden everything gets a bit muddled, you lose clarity, you lose definition in the mix. Luckily with dLive, that's not the case. So you can add as many channels as you like. You can have a full desk with 128 input channels, 16 effects returns, and it will still sound pristine. It will still sound as it would with a much lower number of channels. And that's partially thanks to the architecture that we use and what we call the variable bit depth. So the ability to choose the bit depth for each and every stage of the processing and the summing. Specifically with the summing, we use 96-bit or fixed point summing for the accumulator. So that gives you an incredible amount of headroom in your calculations, in your maths, which as a result gives you plenty of definition even when you're summing the amount of channels. So that's one question answered. Another one, maybe you can touch on that, Val, is from Cohen. Is there any solution to manage more than 128 channels? How would you go about dealing with a higher number of channels?
Sure. Well, the easy answer is essentially you need two platforms. What's nice with using multiple platforms is by using the tie lines function, there are ways of distributing channels to various locations. So you can use inputs from one mix rack on one surface, on one system, and transfer those channels very easily across to multiple platforms as well. So at this time, dLive is a 128 channel mixing platform. So the solution is to expand, and that expansion might be with a second dLive system, but it could very well be with an SQ or with an Avantis, because you just need a few more channels that you need to manage, and that might not warrant having a full extra system. That being said, you can connect many more physical inputs to a dLive system. So depending on what you're working with, you can have, I don't have the numbers, I think it's around 800 inputs on an S-Class system connected through using more cards on the input slots, etc. You can still mix 128 of those channels, but you can connect many more. So again, you could have 200 channels connected to one system with various expanders, etc., and then use tie loans to distribute those to another mixer to do sub mixes and stuff like that. So lots of approaches that can be very simple or even more complex if you want to.
Yeah, I agree with you, Val, that you can have many more physical inputs, and if you're not using all of those at the same time, you can handle different patch scenarios with scenes and presets, and use many more inputs than 128. Also agree with you on the sub mixer or separate mixer, especially when you deal with an orchestra. It's very common to have one engineer with a mixer for the orchestra and then feed into another mixer with all the other contributions from the live band or the presenters. And bear in mind, it doesn't have to be a second dLive. It could be an SQ, an Avantis. You can connect them with an S-Link cable or protocol. There are a couple of workarounds as well. If you just run out of inputs and you wish, well, it would be nice if I had a couple more inputs to play with. I've seen people, for example, reuse the external input of a group bus. That's a neat trick or workaround that you can use. So you can patch a physical input to the external input of a group, and then that group can go to an aux or a matrix or the left and right. So you kind of gain an extra input, assuming you have buses available, obviously.
Yeah, that's a nice trick. And in fact, I remember doing a contemporary orchestra thing quite a long time ago, at the time of analog consoles. So I think I had 72 input channels, but there was also a digital, it was a contemporary piece. And we had a second mixing console that just took those inputs, and that was feeding the analog console with its submix, if you will. So it's in high channel counts, it's pretty common to use submixes. And what's nice with the dLive platform is, as we mentioned already, being able to use an SQ and not having to do complex cable management. So you can still have the inputs connected to the dLive system. Those can go from a GigaAce card in the dLive Surface to an SQ at front of house, and you could do your submix on that. And then your SQ would patch back out of the S-Link straight into the GigaAce card. It's literally one Cat5 cable to expand your mixing capabilities, but all of the I/O, the physical inputs, are still connected to your dLive. So quite a neat solution to expand the capabilities if you need to.
There's another question from Alexander again. If you have any advice for him, Val, about managing crossover projects, pop and orchestra together, would you recommend having two front of house engineers to handle that type
Sure.
of? Yeah.
Well, again, it typically lands more or less on the same or in the same direction. So one option is to expand with a secondary mixer with its own dedicated processing. So that might be an SQ or an Avantis or another dLive system, and you can share inputs with both systems. And that means that both operators have completely independent workflow. Another option with dLive is to use what's known as multi-surface mode, where you have multiple surfaces connected to a single mix rack with completely independent control of processing channels. Now, the only thing to keep in mind when you do multi-surface, and when I say multi-surface, it could be two surfaces, but it could be a surface and a laptop running director as well. So you could have, independent control of the mix rack from a laptop or from a computer. Is that you still only have 128 channels of input processing. So you might have 100 channels for the orchestra side on the main surface, and one person's operating that. And then on secondary surface, he would have access to 28 channels of input, because you've got a bit of pop and some lead vocals and some synths and tracks or whatever. And that would be on the secondary surface with completely independent control. So he's not selecting mixes on the main surface. He's not changing any of that. So there's many ways of spreading out, and multi-surface is, I'd say, the more cost-effective solution. Even if it's just taking it onto a laptop on the side with an IP controller, for example. But then if you've got budget and you want to completely separate things, yeah, why not have two dLive surfaces or two dLive systems sharing the inputs with completely independent processing?
It's very good. There's a couple of requests that came in. Someone was suggesting having DCA Spills or Spills on other buses like groups and auxes, which would be really useful, and it's been requested before. Unfortunately, it didn't make it so far to the short list of selected features for development, but you never know. And Peter is asking about, well, it's all good to talk about inputs, but what about having more outputs, more buses? And unfortunately, the architecture is limited to that amount of buses in the FPGA engine. However, again, Peter, you're talking about in-ear and wedge applications. So, for example, one thing I would advise to check out is a personal mixing solution, something like the Mi-1 system, particularly with orchestra applications, where a lot of the in-ears are fixed in one location. They're not in-ear wireless monitors, so they can be wired headphones. In those situations, a system like the Mi-1 can save a lot of submixing and aux buses on the desk, because you can send all of the channels out individually, and the musicians can fine-tune their own personal mix without you necessarily wasting buses at front of house, if that makes sense.
Cool. I see a question from Tom. Could you tell us about applications for the DZero? I'm guessing you mean DMZero, and the C1500 Ti or the CTI 1500. Good call. Someone's paying attention to our website. So we announced some time back, we pre-launched, we gave a teaser of a new version of our C1500, which is the CTI 1500, and that is now available. So speak to your distributor if you want to know more, but I can show you really briefly if I can find the pictures. There we go. Where is it? I think it's that one. Is it that one? Yes, there we go. Let me just share that with you. So yeah, hot off the press pretty much is the CTI 1500. We had a request, and hopefully we'll have many more, because that's all we can hope for the industry, for an even more lightweight C1500 solution, which would allow people to fly with a C1500, fitting it under the weight restrictions of most airlines of 23 kilos. So we previewed this almost a year ago at NAMM in the US, and it's now available for you. If that's something you're interested in, please talk to your distributor. But as you can see, it's a C1500. We've put titanium framework on this, so titanium sides, some titanium reinforcement on the side. We've basically gutted everything we could out of the console, so you can only mix 12 channels with it. No, I'm joking. It's still 128 channels. It's got everything a C1500 has in terms of processing power, in terms of control on the surface itself. It's exactly the same. The only difference being that it's a quite substantial weight gain, and with
weight loss.
Exactly, weight loss, improvement in weight. So it's much more lightweight, and with certain flight cases that we're happy to recommend for you if you want to know more, you can fit it under 23 kilos, like comfortably under 23 kilos, including with our heaviest card, which I think is the MADI card, if I remember correctly. So yeah, it fits inside, and you can even fit an IEC cable in the case as well, and it still fits under, and the cover as well. So yeah, thanks for that question. And then you're asking about DMZero. DMZero is exactly the same as our DM mix racks, our S-Class mix racks. The only difference being there's no physical I/O on it. So it's the same channel processing, card slots, dual redundant power supplies, same number of ports on the front panel. The only difference is there's no physical I/O, making it more compact and more flexible for traveling as well. That's what I use quite often, because I do one-offs and I travel with what I can carry. So you can take that and you can source your I/O locally. So your I/O might be some DX boxes or a GX4816 or whatever, because you can source that pretty much in any country. Or if you're really stuck and you can't find I/O, you could use a Dante card with a DMZero and use other Dante enabled I/O boxes. Not that we'd recommend it, but you know, if you're really stuck, any Dante I/O would work. So hopefully that answers your question as well. So I think we've covered most questions. Nick, have you spotted anything else?
No, I think that's it for the time being.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining, everyone. I do hope you're safe. We've got a few more webinars coming up over the next few days. We've got Keith and Jack who are doing alternate Thursdays, so keep an eye on social media for those. Next week on Monday, I believe, I have a webinar on custom control, and that's focused on expanding your live mixer. So we're talking about using custom control with dLive and with Avantis, and how custom control can be used to expand your mixing capabilities, your control of the system, with some like nice little funky little tips and tricks. So that's coming too. And then I can also recommend that you guys, if you can, join on the 15th of December. We have, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen yet, but it's a Christmas webinar with basically Ask Us Anything. So any questions you might have about I don't know, what we do in our spare time, if you like. But no, yeah, a Christmas special webinar on 15th of December. So yeah, please join if you can. And again, thanks for spending some time. Nick, thanks very much for joining me. Thanks again to Ian for his interview, and thanks to you all for joining. Stay safe and catch you soon.
Yeah, thank you and goodbye.